Welcome back, viewers. You're watching Beyond World is One. I'm Shivan Chandna. This is our rolling coverage of the high-stakes Alaska summit, the Trump-Putin meet, which ended just minutes ago. Both leaders addressed a joint presser, took no questions from the press, gave out their statements. Let's listen in again to the remarks which were made by the Russian president, who started speaking first.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. There was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots that buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they've fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue, naturally under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And Special Envoy of the President, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then, that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
And that was the Russian president speaking first after that 2 hours, 50 minutes meeting between the Russian and US president in Alaska. All right, to discuss this further, I'm now being joined on the broadcast by Peter Khnik, Professor of History and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, joining us from Washington, D.C. Mr. Khnik, thanks so much for making time for us. Of course, big statements that have come in. There was a lot of anticipation before this summit. Now it's finally done. No questions were taken from the press. Big statements coming in from the two leaders, and both of them really patting each other's back, if I were to really put it in as little words as possible. Let me just quickly get your take or your big highlights for you from the statements that came in.
I think that it was great that the meeting occurred. There were a lot of people who tried to sabotage it, who were hoping and praying that it was going to be a failure. And clearly, the signal that it had been a failure would be Trump addressing the press by himself. Well, that didn't happen. So it was not a failure in that way. However, there were no details. They talked about agreeing on so many topics, and the only thing that we heard any agreement on was that if Trump had been president in 2022 instead of Biden, that it wouldn't have started in the first place. So they said they had agreements. They said it was friendly. They seemed friendly. They talked a little bit about potential economic deals. They didn't hardly spoke at all about a ceasefire or peace in the war. So, Trump is going to have his phone conversations now with the heads of NATO and the coalition of the willing and others. Maybe something will come out of that, but we did not get any substance whatsoever. The fact that they're going to keep on talking is great, because these kinds of serious negotiations aren't usually wrapped up in 2 hours and 15 minutes. They sometimes take weeks or months, or in the case of the Korean War, they could take years. And they went on for years with Vietnam also. So it's not surprising that they didn't reach it, but it was a 2 hour, 15-minute meeting. They had projected beforehand that it could go 6 or 7 hours. What does that tell us? Again, we're trying to read the tea leaves rather than hearing anything concrete or specific from either of the leaders. So they like each other, they get on well, they ride in the car together, not quite as good as Putin and George W. Bush, where Putin actually drives the car. But, it was a positive, very tentative step forward, and they should be encouraged to keep meeting. There are many who say that Putin played Trump. He wanted to avoid the secondary sanctions, and he's going to drag it on longer. And while he's dragging it on, Russia's going to gain more territory, and maybe take Pokrovsk. And if they take Pokrovsk, then they can take the Donbass, and then they have de facto, effectively, what they want, which would be the entirety of the Donbass. Maybe that's what's going to come out of this. But we do need to improve relations between the U.S. and Russia. These are the world's two dominant nuclear powers. It's good that Trump and Putin get along, because these are the two men who could end life on the planet. And for the United States and Russia to be pointing thousands of nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert at each other and to not be talking is very dangerous. They talked about the possibility before the meeting of a new nuclear deal to replace the New START deal when that ends in February 2026. I'd be especially glad to see that. And hopefully they made some real progress. And it wasn't at anybody's expense.
Mr. Khnik, you brought in a lot of perspective here. And as you highlighted that, there was no statement or substance in terms of the way forward. There was some highlighting of what has happened in the past. For example, Putin mentioned about what happened in 2022. It completely endorsed Trump's statements that had Trump been president, this war would have never happened. He also spoke about, Trump saying that Russia hoax. It was a hoax completely, and they've definitely been happy talking. The body language was quite different, at least for Trump, before and after, that meeting. But how often do you see Putin and Trump in the same frame, and Putin speaking more than Trump? But let's quickly show our viewers what Trump said after the meeting that the two leaders had, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound. And I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on. Most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Radcliffe. Thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. It made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that was the US president who spoke for all of about 3 minutes after the meeting with Vladimir Putin, called the Russian president by his first name, Vladimir, many times. And the only 4 words which came out from the Russian president in English were next time in Moscow. And that really got a lot of minds working, thinking what that might mean, because Trump had already pegged for a follow-up trilateral between Putin, Trump and Zelensky. And Putin threw that Moscow card in the end, saying it perhaps can happen in Moscow. And Trump did not shut it down. He said he may get heat for it, but he's open to it. Let me quickly now go back to Mr. Khnik, who's there with me on the broadcast. Mr. Khnik, that last statement, let's quickly just delve into that for a bit. The fact that Putin knew exactly what he wanted to say, and he said it in English, everything else was in Russian. Your take on, what he meant, or what he perhaps would imply if that meeting were to happen in Moscow?
Well, it's an interesting response by Trump, because I know all about the plans for a follow-up meeting in Russia. I think most of the world knew that Putin had invited Trump to a follow-up meeting in Russia, and Trump made it sound like it's the first time he's ever heard this idea. Maybe whatever cartoon show he watches on television missed that one, but he had to know about this. And the fact that they met for the first time in the United States, and it was Putin's first trip to the United States in 10 years, and the symbolic significance of meeting in Alaska, which had been part of Russia, now is part of the United States, showing that territories can change ownership, and that does happen, and also the Arctic resources that they could pursue together, and the history of Alaska, which Putin alluded to. So it was significant that they met there, and it was appropriate to meet next time in Russia. Now, we don't know if that means Zelensky's going to be invited to that meeting, or if this is going to be a more drawn-out process, and eventually Zelensky will get invited. But he has to be included, and better sooner than later, because they're not going to get an enduring peace without Ukraine's sign-in or agreement. And what do they don't want the war to break out again. They don't want constant guerrilla warfare to go on in those territories that Russia is going to be taking. So they need to get Ukraine's buy-in, which means that it's going to have to be somewhat of a win-win. They have to offer Ukraine something. Now, Trump alluded to one big issue that they couldn't agree on. It couldn't have been NATO, because everybody knows that NATO will be off the table for Ukraine. And it could have been territories. Is Putin demanding all of Donetsk, even though he only controls 70%? He might be willing to take the current fighting line in Zaporizhia and Kherson, but he wants to get the entire Donbass. We know that maybe that's a stumbling block. Maybe the stumbling block is future security guarantees. Zelensky and the Europeans have been calling for a European peacekeeping force or a NATO force to provide security. Zelensky wants security. Russia's talked about demilitarizing Ukraine. Russia has also said he's not going to accept any NATO troops in Ukraine. So what does that mean? Will Ukraine accept an international peacekeeping force through the United Nations? That'll include Chinese troops. We don't know what other troops could be included. It was very interesting to me. I knew that something might come of this today when Trump, before the meeting started, talked about his phone call from the plane with Lukashenko from Belarus. And he's talked about what a great, highly respected international statesman Lukashenko is. Everything that's ever been said about him in any American media is that he's a dictatorial thug. So the fact that Trump took that kind of approach and started off with that tone, to me was promising, because I'm looking for something positive to come out of this, something positive for everybody. And the reason, and I've been on today with various people, Ukrainian parliamentary members, with the former defense minister from Lithuania. And it's shocking to me to hear how rabid some of these people are in their hatred, comparing Putin to Hitler and Stalin, and never wanting to give an inch or negotiate. And what I don't understand is, if they don't come up with a resolution quickly, and this goes on for another 6 months or a year, Ukraine is going to be in a worse position militarily and every other way than it is now. There'll be tens of thousands or scores of thousands more dead and wounded.
I hear your point.
And Russia will control more land.
Mr. Khnik, you've made some very, very important observations here. And, also the fact that when you speak about Ukraine, Trump did mention now it is up to Ukraine to agree to the terms. How well Europe and Ukraine is going to be sleeping tonight? Well, that remains to be seen, because this meeting seems to be good for Russia and US. What it really would mean for the battlefield or for Ukraine or for the Ukrainian land that is Ukraine today, that is something we will need to wait and watch how this one pans out. There is lots more to discuss. I'll need to quickly slip into a short break. Stay with us. And this is WION World is One. This is our continuous coverage of the Alaska summit and all the developments that have come in. That was Mr. Peter Khnik, who was joining us on the broadcast, sharing some deep insights on what this meeting and the statements that have come from the two presidents would really mean for the way forward. This is WION. I'm Shivan. Come right back after this break.